Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this event on the deal that China has recently brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two bitter rivals, we might say, of the Middle East that have been competing over regional influence for years now, that have been competing over power and prestige within the Muslim world, that have been competing through their proxies in many contexts and conflicts of the region, Yemen above all, but not only. So Iran, Saudi Arabia, a made in China Rapprochement. This is the title of our event today. Allow me a few housekeeping rules. The event is hosted in the frame of the Rome Med Dialogues Conference, which is the annual gathering on the Mediterranean region, Middle East and North Africa, which is co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, that has reached its 9th edition this year. Today's webinar is part of our monthly activities that we host sort of in preparation of the physical gathering in Rome that this year will take place from November the 2nd to November the 3rd. So as I was mentioning, on March 10, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to reestablish diplomatic relations, and the agreement was brokered by China. It was reached and announced in the Chinese capital Beijing, and it formally ends years of tensions throughout the Gulf and throughout the Middle East region. Provided that if the deal were to be successful, we of course are leaving the very initial stages of a process that may prove difficult, that may prove tiring as well, because China may be willing to strike this deal, but whether it will be willing to act as a guarantor of the deal, that is another question. So a process that may prove difficult, a process that may prove tiring, and a process that could last long. So provided all these, and having said this, the deal that was reached in Beijing of course opened up to a number of questions that are very important, to a number of implications that will likely shape the equilibrium of the regions for the weeks, months, maybe years to come. It depends how it goes, of course. So it opened up to a lot of questions that we will discuss with our speakers today, which I'm happy to introduce. So Cinzia Bianco, who is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Abdolrasool Divsallar, who is a visiting professor and non-resident scholar at the Catholic University of Milan, and also a non-resident scholar, I suppose, at the Middle East Institute of Washington, and then Gangzheng, pardon my horrible pronunciation in Chinese, who is assistant professor at the Department of IR at the Tsinghua University. So welcome to our speakers. Thanks a lot for being here with us today to discuss this very important development for the region. Before handing over to our guests, I should remind the audience that is listening to us that there is a possibility to ask for to pose Q&A to our speakers throughout the chat, and I will convey them to our guests. So I would start with Cinzia, if I may. And Cinzia, I would like to ask you, so this agreement addresses some of the major sources of tension between Riyadh and Tehran since 2016. You are an expert on the Gulf area. So whereas it addresses some of these issues, it also implicitly leaves some others behind. What is the rationale between the deal? Can you help us navigate it? Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, and for the invitation. And I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion on quite a momentous event. So I think, if you talk to the Saudis, they would often say that this is not exclusively, not a deal that you get done with in one go. More the agreement to start a roadmap towards the normalization of relations. So it's the beginning of a process rather than the end of the process. And from their point of view, it is very important. It is a very important process because they finally got the other side, thanks to also Chinese encouragement. So the Iranians to deal with the most important file seen from Riyadh, which is the end of weapons transfer to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and an active commitment by Tehran to encourage the Houthis to accept a peace deal offered by Saudi Arabia, which has been on the table for some time now, and to respect that peace deal. This is basically the same deal that the Saudis had offered Iran since 2019 in 5 different meetings. And until in April 2022, they got tired of the impasse because the Iranians basically wanted to deal with Yemen for last instead of dealing with Yemen first. And they wanted to get going on reopening the embassies and then starting economic relations, trade, getting possibly Saudi investments and so on. Whereas from the Saudi point of view, Yemen was the single most important issue to possibly unlock anything and everything else. So it seems now that the scene from Saudi Arabia, the Iranian regime would be much more under pressure due to domestic protests, due to the international, de facto death of the JCPOA, with a complete change of heart from European governments towards Tehran after it was proven that Iran was delivering weapons to Russia. And all of these sort of external pressures, it seems, from a Saudi perspective, that made Iran more conciliatory to finally accept that the detente should really start and be centered on the Iranian role in Yemen. So the expectation from the Saudi side is that this deal will pave the way for a resolution of the regional dimension of the conflict, and in particular, the stop to cross-border attacks that originated from Yemen into Saudi territory. And this would be quite a big thing for Saudi Arabia, given that in some points they were getting dozens of attacks on a daily basis. Most of them, over 90%, were intercepted, but still it is a very significant threat that disrupts also important plans of economic development, for example, and ambitions that Saudi Arabia harbors.
Thank you, Cinzia. Thanks a lot. Abdolrasool, I'd come to you. So Cinzia was diving into the Saudi perspective. What is the Iranian perspective on this very important development, and why, according to you, has Tehran decided to even seal this deal?
Well, thank you, Chiara, for having me in this panel, a very timely discussion. I think from the Iranian perspective, we need to see the issue from the 2 big tenets of foreign policy. First, from the point of the look to the East perspective, which is Iran tending to work more with Russia and China in a bid to actually decouple itself from the West. And the second tenet of Raisi administration of neighborhood policy, which shares the same objective. Well, the deal fits in this broad perspective. However, in a very more detailed look at the situation to understand that why Iranians accept at this moment actually the concessions that led to the deal, I think we can lead to 3 major factors. The first is a possible change in the balance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that, as Cinzia mentioned, relates to the domestic situation that happened in Iran in the last 6-7 months. To be precise, I think Iranians underestimated the Saudis' capability in intervening in their domestic issues. That was what Iranian claimed for a long time. And the Saudis showed quite capable by their public policy to be successfully imposing pain and use the rifts that existed in the political system in Islamic Republic in Iran. So that basically brought up the idea that there are leverages on the Saudi side that Iran needs to answer, and probably that answer goes to some sort of leverages that Iran has probably in Yemen. So apart from this change of the power balance, perception of power imbalance from the Iranian side, I think the second factor relates to a very long-standing issue from the Iranian side that for a long time, Iran looked at it with a very cautious eyes, and that relates to the Israeli-Arab possible normalization, Israeli-Saudi possible normalization. I think If you put it more precisely, for the Iranian side, living with a number of countries that have a normal relation with Israel by itself probably is not problematic. The problem starts from the point that the Iranians claim that Saudis might have a role or might take a role in a sort of a coalition that centers Iran as its core area or shared threat perception. And the deal basically, especially by relying on non-intervention articles that it's mentioned in 2001 security agreement between Riyadh and Tehran, probably help Iranians to calm down this threat perception. That means that it prevents Saudi from entering in a sort of a military security alliance or complicates at least this prospect that Saudis enter to the kind of a cooperation with Israel that has a security military dimension. So part of the logic under Iranian mindset after tensions rise over nuclear and regional issues was to address this issue as fast as possible. The third issue, this third factor, I think, relates to the idea that Tehran thinks with the deal, at least what we see in the current, based on the current information, it can somehow secure the gains that it had throughout the region. We're talking about Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, which Iran had an upper hand regarding Saudi Arabia. And the deal is not initially touching on those points. And that is a good thing for Tehran because it means that Tehran should not spend its scarce resources on the areas for competition with Saudi Arabia and actually can, through a deal, somehow safeguard what it has gained. But it's important, I think, that we notice what the deal is not. I think the deal is not, as mentioned before, you said it in your introduction, the deal is not a comprehensive grand bargain. It does not talk at all about a very profound military threat perception that exists on both sides. I think Iran-Saudi relationship, especially from the Iranian perception, has been militarized heavily during the last 5-6 years. Iran started to look at Saudi Arabia as a possible threat, a military threat, something that we didn't have it before. It was US and Israel is the only main military threat to Iran. Iran has started to revise this perception, and basically means that many military plans, doctrines, or approach to the areas of security, core security issues, which Iranians have took in order to respond to Saudi's military plans, are not going to change. That basically means regional proxies, which work as an important part of Iran's deterrence capability. The missile program, that's not going to change with the deal. And basically, for a simple reason from the Iranian perspective, because Saudis are also not changing their missile defense cooperation, for example, with the United States or other areas or key defense areas. So I want to say that there are some positive points, but at the same time, we need to look at the limits and constraints that the deal has. And as you said, this is just the beginning. And I think also Iranians view that as a beginning of the process, not the end game, but a process that, the objective or the end game for each side somehow still looks different. So I stop here.
Thank you, Abdolrasool. Yes, of course, I didn't mind to be pessimistic, but just realistic. You know, it's the very initial stage of a process whose consequences, whose evolutions we still don't know. But thanks for raising so many points. Hopefully, we'll come back to some of them later, including the role of, not the role, but how Israel and other actors, including the US, look at this agreement. But now, Gangzheng, let me come to you. And let us dive into China's interests in striking this deal. So China's action in the Gulf and the Middle East in general so far had been more characterized, let's say, by a business-focused, energy-focused, economic-focused approach. We were discussing this before starting the session. China has been traditionally more of an economic actor in the Middle East and North Africa than a political one. What does China's mediation in this Saudi-Iran rivalry today tells us about the role that Beijing is trying to play in the region?
Okay.
Please.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for having me here. I think, as you mentioned, that traditionally speaking, China was seen as the player that focusing solely on the economic aspects. But let's not forget that, like, let's take a look about the history after the founding of the People's Republic. China actually has been playing many different kind of roles in the regions. So in the very beginning, it has been a helper by the side of the Soviet Union to help it have this kind of like expansion of influence in the region. And later, China became a radical challenger to both superpowers in the region, and by supporting the PLO and FLN and other forces in the Middle East and North Africa region, including the Gulf and all this kind of like Zofar movements. And later, it became the helper of the United States against the so-called Soviet expansions. And only after, I think, the Cold War, China became this kind of like to start to adopt this economy first line that take advantage in one way or another of the regional security architecture or security structure that led by the United States and solely focusing or mainly focusing on the economic developments. Okay, and so this is kind of like under the unipolar moment that China gave such a impression that is kind of like to try to make no friends, but to make friends with, try to make no enemies, but try to make friends with whoever want to do business. So I think the major change that we can see from the current progress, for example, by this agreement, we can see that there's a change in the patterns of China's movement. Obviously, that in the last few decades, China, the idea is to follow the trend, or to follow the currents. But now, with the growing interest in the Middle East and in particular in the Gulf, I think China trying to gain some experience by trying to create the trend or to make the trend. As we use some different expressions in China, or according to Chinese philosophies, that with more powers, you might have the abilities to make the trend or to create the trend and not just follow the trend. Okay, and in this process, I think there are at least several aspects that we should pay attention to. The first one is that China actually, with its growing interest in the region, China has this kind of intention, incentive to promote the regional stabilities. This is not just about the bilateral relations between Tehran and Riyadh, but also related to some proximities. The regions, for example, in Iraq, where China also has great amount of investments. It also related to Yemen, that obviously has these close connections to both Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also, as the last panelist just mentioned, the issue, let's not forget the risk of an Israeli attack on Iran was actually on the rise in the past few months. So I think by brokering this kind of like a peace deal, I think China directly or indirectly led the Israelis to need to have a second thought before launching this kind of like a possible attack, like by the way of the Gulf countries. So in one or another, I think China tries to promote regional stabilities, because due to the previous experience, all this kind of like sudden upheavals or sudden disturbance in the region often caught China off guard and caused great losses for China's interest in the region. Okay, so this is the first thing. And then I think the second thing is that let's put it into the broader picture of the Sino-US competitions. I think China, after the second term of the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, I think China, one of the deepest fear that China have is that some countries, especially the US allies, might join the US effort into decoupling from China or eventually isolate China. So in China's eyes, I think one of the very important goals is to try to create this what we call as the so-called new intermediate zone, that all these countries in certain regions that would not necessarily join the U.S. to follow the U.S. lead into the effort to decouple from China. And I think from the Beijing's observation, especially during this kind of the Russia's war in Ukraine, I think most Middle Eastern countries have no interest into joining one side against the other. So for China, I think it is in its interest to promote the cooperation, inter-regional cooperation in the Gulf, and keep these regions to have this hedging strategy or balancing strategy between the great powers, and including between China and the United States. And the last thing, I think China is like, by promoting this so-called global security initiative, it tries to bring about this kind of like new norms in dealing with international conflicts. It is not based on the traditional concept that we are familiar, that it's like based on this kind of like deterrence, military buildup in certain regions, or this kind of military interventions, but more based on this kind of like to provide the prospect based on the current ongoing economic exchange, but also provide more profitable, prosperous economic prospects, and also with the help of history that has been relatively neutral to both parties. So I think China has this kind of like ideas that maybe it could also help bring some kind of like new norms into the practice in international relations. And by this also by this example in the very turbulent regions in the Gulf.
Thank you, Gangzheng. I think we'll also come back to these, how can I say, this inclusion of new norms from China in the global order, and how China is actually trying to curve for itself a very different new role in the international arena. But let's go back to Cinzia to get more into detail of the Yemeni context. You mentioned Yemen before. Mention is of course one of the theaters where the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran has been seen the most, and it's also one of the most horrible tragedies and long wars in the region. What consequences do you think that this agreement will have on the Yemeni situation?
So the expectation, I think, is that there will be two major consequences. The first one would be that Iran would stop smuggling weapons to the Houthis. And that, includes both the maritime route, which was very, very active until very recently. I mean, both the US and France have intercepted large shipments of weapons clearly coming from Iran and directed towards Yemen, but also the terrestrial route, if you wish, which is a route that also takes advantage of the porosity of borders between Oman and Yemen. And that Tehran would also encourage actively the Houthis to cooperate with Saudi Arabia on a peace deal that has been already on the table for some time, which includes stopping cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia in exchange for some political recognition of the Houthis. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Saudis are aware that the war in Yemen has been quite a significant failure, has become a financial failure, a reputational failure, and a military and political failure as well. So if you look at the trajectory of their objectives in Yemen, they keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And I think that right now, their most significant objective is to stop the regional dimension of the war, and then, of course, accompany Yemen towards stabilization, supporting the work of the United Nations Special Envoy to solve the war for once and for all. But I don't think that the Saudis intend to be that heavily involved as they have been so far in the next future. I think they will they will get this deal done with the Houthis, and then they will, of course, contribute to a roadmap of the political dialogue, but through the United Nations, not unilaterally, and they will support a multilateral framework. Now, if we look at the Yemen context specifically, what that might mean, I'm not very optimistic if you look again at the Yemen context itself. I think it's most likely that the Houthis will take advantage of having of not having to worry about Saudi air raids to push again south into Shabwa in particular, which is a Yemeni region that is oil rich, and into Marib, which is another region that is oil rich in the north. And that will obviously trigger the Southerners in particular, because as we know, in the south, there are strong movements, not only the Southern Transitional Council, but a number of strong movements well-rooted in the territory that either argue for a full-on partition of Yemen, or at least want to make sure that the Houthis don't have overbearing influence on their own territories. So I do expect that there will be a revamping of the north-south conflict, and that might also get violent. Maybe not immediately. I think immediately we are looking at, this Ramadan, I think we're looking at a more peaceful time. We have already seen today the Houthis agreeing to a very large-scale prisoners exchange deal that also involves the Yemeni legitimate government and Saudi Arabia. So we are seeing some small positive steps. And again, I think this Ramadan should be more or less peaceful and should be on the sort of repercussions of getting this regional dimension of the war done. But it is quite likely that soon after Ramadan, that we could see, again, violence between the north and the south, because the truth of the matter is that the Yemen conflict has always been three wars in one. It's always been the international war, the regional war, and the local war. So even if you are done and close the international and regional war, you are left with a local conflict. And here, regional players will keep having their own interests, and we know that there still will be, as Abdolrasool also said, there still will be different and divergent interests, not only between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also to some extent between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But I think the intention is really to try and remove that regional layer into the conflict. And then, that will certainly make Yemen slightly less complex, in my opinion, than it has been so far.
Thank you, Cinzia, for your very deep analysis. Abdolrasool, unavoidably, we cannot not mention the JCPOA when it comes to Saudi-Iranian relations. Do you think we can consider this agreement? Of course, the JCPOA, as you know, is in stalemate for a number of reasons, but can we consider this agreement as the eventual end of the JCPOA and the hopes to see it revised somehow, sometime?
Well, that's an important question. I should say I don't think that we can jump to that conclusion at this moment. But let me explain why. I think the grand principle behind Iran's security policy is based on simple fact that they don't want to have several crises at the same time. The nuclear crisis, the regional crisis, and a domestic crisis. So that move to make somehow de-escalate with Saudis is a sign to this logic that Tehran wants to have to separate the various files that it has and to cut possible links between them. What I mean by that is that I don't see a change in Iran's nuclear policy because of the deal with Saudi Arabia, and that's because Iran's nuclear file is very much, as from perspective of Iranian view, it's very much something between Iran and United States. Regional actors are not part of that discourse. Tehran's position on that has not changed. Even Europeans, Russians, and Chinese, from the Iranian perspective, are not part of that. They are facilitators or could be spoilers. So the deal on the nuclear front is something that Washington and Tehran should resolve and should end that. Others can help or can not help. The point here is that however, the deal might have impacts on the JCPOA, I think still in two ways. First, I think the first scenario is that, which I think in Tehran people less believe in that, and that is a scenario which Saudi Arabia becomes helpful in restoring the JCPOA. It tries to use its means in order to convince Washington or help somehow the deal come back to its normal track. However, the second more important scenario is where hints to the fact that Iranians are not so much hopeful of the revival of JCPOA. So as I said, they try to delink between possible crises and prevent possible synergy among three crises of domestic, regional, and nuclear fronts. So they want to make a more relaxed environment on the regional front because they're believing that their nuclear file will go away, continue be in the similar situation. So we will see somehow a status quo on the nuclear front in which there are some short-lived small deals with IAEA and Iran, but a full return to JCPOA remains ambitious plan, at least at this moment, because of various calculations on the Iranian side. However, the benefit from the Iranian view of the deal at this moment is that, as I said, it prevents or it complicates Israel's plan B if the current situation goes ahead and Iran wants to continue its nuclear policy as it is doing right now. And at the same time, it will eliminate or reduce regional pressure on the United States to go for the plan B. So what Iran is doing is somehow sealing or an attempt to sealing the nuclear file from the regional pressures or regional spoiling effects, which Tehran believed was one of the factors in Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal.
Thank you, Abdolrasool. Gangzheng, let me hand it over to you again. So China is the largest trading partner for both Iran and Saudi Arabia, although Beijing's trade with the two countries has developed quite differently in recent times. What is the current state of China's economy relations with Riyadh and Tehran, and how do you think that will and if these differences will, and if yes, how affect China's balancing act between Tehran and Riyadh?
Okay, I think this is a very important question because I think the economic connections between Beijing and both Iran and Saudi Arabia is a very important component to facilitate the agreement, because China is the number one trading partners with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, and actually with most Middle Eastern countries. So I think there are similarities, both similarities and difference in the patterns of the economic exchange between China and these two countries. For example, I think the energy still occupies a very important positions in the economic relations between China and these relations. And but I think the economic connections between China and Iran is more limited due to the heavy sanctions imposed by the U.S. and other international institutions. So I think there are quite limited, including this kind of like energy and some kind of like infrastructures, and very limited kind of like other production and investments. However, in contrast, I think the cooperation between China and Saudi Arabia is having a much more diverse patterns in the last few years. I think the energy from the traditional focus of energy to this kind of like energy and infrastructures to many other new emerging fields, including this kind of like the renewable energy, the new energies, the green energies, the production cooperations, and also the 5Gs. With this kind of like growing concerns from the West, including the Europe and the United States against the Huawei and other Chinese telecom giants, I think the Gulf countries became a very important destinations for China's technology companies to promote its internationalization process. And also, I think there has been other growing fields, such as the drones, like the UAV systems, no matter it is in civilian use or in this kind of like military use, this has all been this kind of like promising aspects in the cooperation, economic cooperation between China with the Gulf countries in general and with Saudi Arabia in particular. So I think that since we mentioned this kind of like agreements and its impact for future economic exchange, I think it has this kind of like a potential that if we can actually materialize this kind of like agreements, that might create in the long run that this kind of like what I see as the triangle economic circles or cooperations, that because for now China has this kind of like different strategies to have this synergy of development strategies with different Middle Eastern countries, like with some kind of like countries that with rich human resources, it has this kind of like a tendency to transform production capacities, and those kind of like countries with rich capital resources, China has been focusing on this kind of like mutual way investments and also the joint development R&D projects. So I think if these three countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, that in the long run can make this kind of like a close, more intimate or feasible cooperation in economic terms, that might create a scenario that China might work with Saudi Arabia to have this kind of like regional headquarters for transnational companies or development centers in the Gulf countries, and also this kind of like production facilities in Iran, like with one way to lift the sanctions or bypass the sanctions, that would create a very interesting triangle economic connections. But I think this is arguably a long shot that still waits us for further observations.
Thank you, Gangzheng. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a very, very quick third and last round of Q&A before opening up to the audience. A few questions are arriving already. So very brief, Cinzia. If Iran and Saudi were to eventually restore diplomatic relations, if this process of rapprochement were to be successful, how do you think that Saudi Arabia's relations with international partners like the US, but also Israel, why not, will be affected, if they will be affected? 1 minute. If you can answer this in 1 minute, you'll receive a prize.
Yes, I will do it in less. I think a helpful framework to look at Saudi policy right now is the combination of extreme hedging and strategic ambiguity. I think the Saudis are trying, and so far partially with success, to engage both the US and China, Russia and Ukraine, and the Europeans, and why not, Iran and Israel. So I don't think that necessarily we will see the end of talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel towards normalization. For as long as that would be feasible, the Saudis will continue to hedge. What I think is relevant to say is that they also have expectations of the benefits that they can draw from this hedging. And one of them is betting on whether China can only be a facilitator and host of this deal, or actually is committed to being a guarantor by leveraging, for example, its economic relations with Iran, if Iran were to break the agreement. And that's, I think, something that we have all been wondering, and maybe our colleague can help answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Cinzia. Abdolrasool, so Iran and China have struggled to implement the 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership signed in March 2021 after long negotiations. Do you think will China-Iran relations may be experiencing a new positive phase and following this agreement? In 1 minute as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that Iran-China relationship at the political secure level is already in a very good level of relationship. What lacks and could be still more, that's the economic front. But there are the limits of the sanctions. And until JCPOA is not there are not really realistic opportunities to raise the level of Iran and Chinese trade. So saying that, I think, as I mentioned earlier in my argument, that I think from the Iranian perspective, things with Saudi Arabia are only securitized and militarized. Chinese involvement was an opportunity because it provided Iran to solve part of the security concerns that it had. This is one point. And the second point is that Iran sees China as a vehicle for creating multilateral formats that can limit the space for the United States. The argument here is not a discussion that Iran wants to expel. That might be a long-term objective of Tehran's hardliners. But they're also realistically knowing that through these types of small-scale multilateral formats, they can limit the freedom of action of the United States, and that's where the goal meets. And last word, I think it's important that we realize that this is a mutual deal. So there is a mutual security agreement between the two parties. There are commitments by Iranians, there are commitments by Saudis. So I think we need to consider that the failure of the deal can happen by both sides not actually doing their commitment. That was what happened to JCPOA when Trump administration got out from the JCPOA. It was against many speculation, it was the United States that stopped implementing its commitment. So I think it's clear here that Iran's mentality to come and talk with China was from the logic that Iran had this fear that Saudis will not do their commitments. And here China has probably a possibility or a kind of a tool to impact Saudi Arabia to remain in the deal.
Thank you, Abdolrasool. Thank you very much. Gangzheng, if you agree, I would convey Cinzia's question to you. China is trying to establish itself as a peacemaker in the Middle East. It has been doing so in other contexts as well, like Ukraine, for instance. So it's clearly trying to have a more positive diplomatic role in world politics, but that takes a lot, and it's not easy to do, let's say. So when it comes to this Iranian-Saudi possible process of rapprochement, as we discussed, what do you think would happen how would you think that China would behave in case one of the two parties should break the agreement or if rivalries should arise?
Okay. First of all, I think that the China's behavior in recent years, in particular through this kind of like peace agreement, is obviously due to its growing interest in the foreign lands, including the Gulf, including the Middle East. But also, I think it is partly due to the personal interest of President Xi. He has been showing his visible interest in becoming a peace broker. I think in the very beginning when he became the president of China, I think in 2014, 2015, he had this kind of like interest in facilitating the negotiating between the Israelis and the Palestinians for a while. But obviously the case there is much more complex for China to solve by then and even by now. So I think so the president didn't push so hard, and now this kind of like opportunities, and it also leads to this kind of like discussions about China's possible role in this kind of like bringing the peace proposal to the Russia's war in Ukraine. Although I think that it follows the same kind of logic that China tries to to have this kind of like a banner to be a responsible peace broker, and also trying to promote stability, especially considering China's interest to have cooperation with European countries. But I think the Ukraine case is much more difficult than the Saudi Iranian case, because I think in the Gulf case, I think both countries have realized they have this kind of like diminishing marginal benefits in continuing the conflict, but not so much in the Ukrainian cases. And regarding the question from the colleagues about what China would do, I think it will always be a very challenging aspect, because at the time, as mentioned before, it will always be hard to blame which one is the first one to breach the agreement. There will always be multiple narratives to accusing each other. So I think China doesn't have this kind of like fantasy that it will control all the situation with its own hand for now. And in the foreseeable future, I think China would do is mainly about to walk behind the scene and trying to cooling the tensions if there's something go wrong. I think, as mentioned by the colleague later, it was like possible that the conflict in Yemen will reduce into the domestic level, so it will create room for China to navigate through this kind of like mess.
Thank you very much, Gangzheng. I have now two questions from our Q&A chat from the public that I will convey to Abdolrasool and to Cinzia. So to Abdolrasool, how was the agreement received in Washington? According to you, what signals does it send to Israel and the future of the Abraham Accords? And to Cinzia, you said this agreement could pave the way to stop cross-border attacks in Yemen. How realistic do you see that? I should ask again to be very brief in your answers, because we already ran out of time. So Abdolrasool, I will start with you, if I may, please.
Sure. I think there's two narratives when it comes to U.S. position on that. First, the official one, which is welcoming this de-escalation process. That's the U.S. government's official position that welcomes the process. However, on the intellectual level, I mean, on the debate that has created, I think it has raised the argument that how and why actually U.S. superior role in leading regional security might be impacted by the Chinese brokered deal. Actually, a deal that is not. It's one of the major first deal in the region that not broked by U.S. or U.S. is not present there, and that's for sure. It's an area of concern for U.S. national security, and that raises various discussions about whether U.S. should rethink its part of its involvement in the region. However, I don't see any major change in the U.S. policy when it comes to region. There is no argument about change of major policy either in order to promote the U.S. presence by giving more consensus to Saudis, or by any other change in the policy. However, when it comes to Israeli issue, I think we need to consider that in any sense, the Israelis had this idea, wishfully or not, that they can put Iran as the shared threat of the region. So a shared threat that is between Iran and between Israel and Arab countries. I think by definition, normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia will impact the possibility of considering Iran as a shared threat perception, because basically that means that Saudi Arabia is engaging diplomatically while Israel is not, and it's still seeing the pressure and military campaign as the solution. So I think on that strategic level, there are some rifts there. But as said here, I see that there is not a kind of a zero-sum game here. I think normalization between Saudi and Israel have its own dynamic, which is not necessarily influenced by only Iran-Saudi factor. There are Palestinian issues, there are public domestic issues in Saudi Arabia and a broader Arab world. And I think that broader dynamic partly can be influenced by but not be shaped by this deal.
Thank you, Abdolrasool. Cinzia?
I think it is quite likely that Iran will respect its commitment, because we've heard from Abdolrasool and other Iranian experts that there is an actual value for Iran to normalize or detente with Saudi Arabia, and the two things are. The one cannot happen with the other. So the moment Iran breaks their commitment on Yemen, the deal with Saudi Arabia is broken. So if Iran has any care whatsoever in having relations with Saudi Arabia, they will respect a deal on Yemen.
Thank you, Cinzia. In the meantime, Gangzheng, there is one very last question for you. If you can be super, super brief. Someone is asking, does China want to have military bases in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, to secure its oil imports? In one sentence.
Okay, in the foreseeable future, I don't see this kind of possibilities. So I think it will only increase the tensions between China and the United States. And I don't think this will happen in the short term.
Thank you, Gangzheng. So we really have to wrap this up. I want to thank you, our speakers, for their participation in this panel. It has been very, very interesting to hear to all of your perspectives. And this is, of course, something that we will keep working on and studying closely. And I hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much. And you can, of course, follow this event and all other activities of the Rome Dialogues throughout our websites, and since yesterday or since today, the Rome Dialogues have also landed on Twitter, so please follow our page. And thank you again very much for being here, to our guests and to our audience, Cinzia, Abdolrasool and Gangzheng. Hope to see you soon.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.